Well, let's start the press preview now for you. That's our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And tonight we're joined by the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the Telegraph's deputy comment editor Annabel Denham. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to you both. Well, we're going to start with the death of Mohamed Al-Fayed. Not many of the papers have been able to have that headline on the front page, but the Mirror does have a picture of him there alongside Diana, Princess of Wales. Rachel, take us into this story.
Yeah, so, I mean, whenever you hear anything about Mohamed Al-Fayed, who, as you say, has died aged 94, it's always followed by that immediate thought, isn't it, that he outlived his son, and the tragedy of that no parent really should have to do that. And so, you know, you sort of imagine that his life was tinged with sadness ever since that fateful day of the car crash with Princess Diana and his son, Dodi Fayed. He's been described as a colourful character, which I think is a bit of a euphemism for someone whose life is surrounded by things that may be fact, may not be fact. We're not quite sure where one begins and the other ends. And also the idea that he was a thorn in the side of the establishment. I think, again, it's hard to separate out whether that's because he was a thorny character or whether it was because he was an outsider who did very, very well in the UK and did well, you know, got some of the sort of assets of the UK, you know, Harrods, the Ritz, a football club, that perhaps, you know, snooty British establishment didn't think, you know, a self-made Egyptian man should have. So again, there's a blurriness around that too, I would say.
And Annabel, another word used to describe him, flamboyant.
Yes, that's right. And I think, Rachel, you're absolutely right about that blurring of the lines between fact and fiction. I'm not sure that they were absolutely certain on his date of birth. I think there was some debate over how old he actually was, but certainly 9 decades on this earth, and there'll be many column inches devoted to that over the coming days. His contribution to business, his relationship with his son's relationship with Princess Diana, the fact that he suffered one of the worst fates that a parent can, but also those repeated attempts at citizenship, you know, his failure to gain acceptance in British society and why that was. And I think that that's going to be, you know, in the history books in the future, I think there'll be so much investigation into why it was that he had those repeated failed attempts at British citizenship.
Yes, and Rachel, we spoke previously to Dr. Tessa Dunlop, the royal historian, and she was saying that that was something that he absolutely craved throughout his life, that acceptance from the establishment.
Yeah, that's right. And I think he had his citizenship rejected twice.
Twice, yeah.
And I think I remember him getting really annoyed with Jack Straw, who's then Home Secretary at one of the times, late 90s, when he was denied citizenship. Took it very personally and saw it as people being out to get him, whereas, you know, I think there were quite valid and concrete reasons for the citizenship being denied around the cash for questions, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, it's understandable in some ways. He obviously paid a huge amount of money in tax. He made massive donations to charity, to particularly Great Ormond Street Hospital. So you can understand perhaps why there was some frustration there. He had 4 British children, so, you know, clearly made a big contribution. He turned Harrods into the epitome of Britishness. So, again, you know, we don't fully understand the reasons why he was rejected, but perhaps it's understandable there was some frustration there.
And prior to the death of his son, Dodi, in that car crash in Paris with Diana, the relationship with the royal family was quite different.
Yeah, I mean, he was someone who actually thought quite well of the royals, as far as I can make out. He enjoyed their company, and particularly enjoyed Princess Diana's company, certainly if the series The Crown is to be believed, although, again, there's that question of where fact begins and fiction begins and fact ends.
Well, it's come in a little late to make most of the front pages, aside from the Mirror. So let's take a look at some of the other front pages for you now. The Financial Times says the UK economy has defied expectations by growing by 2% according to new figures. The Eye hears that ministers were told as long ago as 2019 that there were concerns about the structural integrity of schools, with hundreds still awaiting safety checks. The Mail has the headline, "Hundreds more schools at risk." It's the same story for the Times. Their headline, "When will this school crisis end?" ask parents. And the Telegraph speaks to the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who expresses her concern that members of the police force are too vocal with their political opinions. There it is. Well, let's take you back to Rachel and Annabel now, and we'll look at the Mail's front page, and this is the story about hundreds more at risk concerning the schools, the safety of school buildings. Annabel.
Well, I think when this story first broke and Gillian Keegan came out and insisted that we oughtn't to worry and that there were only 100 or so schools that were going to be affected, I certainly had this sort of sinking feeling that it was going to be a much bigger story than that. And now on the front page of the Mail, the suggestion that hospitals, council houses, courts, police stations, leisure centres are all at risk of collapse because of this wreck, this flawed construction material. So it could be potentially catastrophic. Parents asking when all of this is going to end. Well, it could go on for months, if not years. Pupils being forced to learn in porta cabins. Mail saying that schools have been putting up tented classrooms, and of course some pupils who simply cannot go to school. It's not safe for them to do so, and that's echoes of lockdown, them being forced back to online learning, isolated from their friends, missing out on sport and all the extracurricular that goes with that. A concern that I have is that the government is so concerned about the pressure that it is coming under and where the buck stops. And, Labour have not hesitated to try and point the finger that it's not really focusing on how it can bring this to as swift a resolution as possible.
And the worry and concern, some suggestions that this could continue until 2025, Rachel.
Well, that's right. I mean, I don't know where else you would point the finger if not at the government. But I think that we have a problem here with all government-built buildings. So, it's, as you say, it's not just schools, it's hospitals, it's libraries, it's courts. And there's a double whammy of cause here when we look at this particular government. So it's not just that it's run down and hasn't rebuilt stock. So when we look at all those public buildings, these are buildings that really should have been rebuilt even before we knew about the crumbly concrete. And then we have 13 years of austerity when all of these buildings and infrastructure would have been squeezed even more. And then we have a government that just doesn't have its eye on the ball because it's been, one, infighting, and two, dealing with Brexit. So these things were known, certainly since 2018 at the very latest. We knew about the crumbly school buildings and therefore could have extrapolated that this would apply to other public buildings. What was the government doing in 2018? It was focusing on Brexit. And so there's a compound here of all the things that the government didn't do or was busy not doing or had, for ideologically reasons, restricted the funding to, that have produced this. And I just think that it's this giant metaphor for the failure of government, that we now have these buildings that are literally falling apart and causing all this chaos for parents and, of course, for children, who should be front and centre of any government policy.
And Annabel, that does have to be the question. Why is the government coming to this so late? And children are going back to school next week.
Well, as I say, I think it's afraid of the pressure that it knew and the criticism and the fire that it knew that it was going to come under. But clearly it's not acceptable. If it knew about this problem, at least weeks ago in this 100 or so schools, then it ought to have dealt with them at the start of the summer, not just days before pupils are due to go back. And, it's those who are going to start their A-level years, their GCSE years, those who are starting secondary school, and of course those who will be going into reception. They're starting school for the first time, and parents may not be able to drop them off at the school gates. I think Rachel's right that this, it's hard not to see this as symbolic of our crumbling government and its inability to perform the most basic functions. Something is fundamentally broken here, but let's not forget that austerity did end years ago. The government is spending hundreds of billions of pounds a year and employs nearly 6 million people. Well, what are these people doing?
Literally its job to employ those people. That's what public services are about. It doesn't deserve a medal for that.
No, but it's getting bigger and bigger, and yet the marginal gains seem to be getting narrower and narrower. So I think there needs to be some fundamental
You're not supposed to gain
why it's
from
unable
schools.
to
You're literally
fill its
supposed to run that service as the government.
No, I mean, I agree, but as I say, I think that everything is so skewed at the moment. Look at the size of the NHS, the amount of day-to-day government spending that is going on that, and look at the fact that productivity in the NHS, or indeed across the public sector, has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Something is fundamentally wrong here that needs correcting. But nonetheless, it remains the case that the state is clearly unable to perform some of its most fundamental functions, and
not the state,
all of us are hoping,
the government. Well, the government is unable to perform those functions for ideological reasons.
Sure, but I mean, this problem predates this
perform.
government. It predates this administration.
No, they don't.
This problem has been apparent for decades. The red flag was raised in the mid-1990s, but there were concerns around this rack long before.
The last time
subsequent governments that have failed to
last time Labour was in government,
solely pin this on 13 years of Tory
to
government.
building new schools.
Okay.
And the government scrapped it. The Conservatives scrapped it the minute it got in.
Rachel and Annabel, we are going to leave it there for the moment, but just to say that the Schools Minister, Nick Gibb, is saying that the total number of buildings affected is likely to rise. So it is an ongoing problem. We must think of the parents and children that are at the centre of this. We are going to take a break, though. Welcome back. You are watching the Press Preview. Still with me, Rachel Shabi and Annabel Denham. Welcome back to both of you. Let's have a look at the FT Weekend front page. And this seemingly a positive story about the economy. Official statistics have added almost 2% to the size of the UK economy in a surprise move that showed the country recovered much faster from the pandemic than previously reported. Rachel.
Yeah, the Office for National Statistics has said that it now has much richer data around those lockdown years when data around what businesses were spending and what they were losing was not that easy to come by. Now it is. And so they've revised the figures around the economy upwards, which means that we aren't recovering as slowly as was previously thought. We are ahead of Germany, but still behind France and Italy, although, two caveats. I would imagine that if the Office for National Statistics has revised its stats, maybe those countries would as well. And secondly, how does it feel for people? Do people suddenly feel better? Do we feel richer? Is the cost of living biting less? Did the bill suddenly gone down? The reality is that for most people, this economy is horrible. And I'm not really sure what these figures, how these figures impact either way.
But Annabel, on the face of it, and certainly on paper, this is a good news story.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's quite staggering that the ONS have added this 2% to the size of the UK economy, and that when the Omicron variant was spreading in Britain, our economy was 0.6% larger than pre-pandemic levels, rather than 1.2% smaller. So, no, as you say, it does appear to be a positive story, particularly when you put it in an international context. There had been a sense that since the pandemic, the UK UK had been an outlier, that we had been lagging far behind countries that we would view as our counterparts, that we would compare ourselves to. But no, it turns out that our economy has grown, recovered more quickly than that of Germany. So there's something to cling on to there. But of course, like Rachel says, and the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has said, this does not mean that our economy has made some remarkable recovery. It does not mean that we've had a soft landing. Inflation is still a very persistent problem, and the cost of living crisis still rages on.
Annabel, thank you, and Rachel also.